Thank you all very much for being here tonight for our Siemens lecture, which will be given by Professor Ussama Makdisi from Rice University. His title, A Brief History of Anti-Sectarianism in the Arab World. I know that the community here, the fellows, and the rest of us are looking forward to this very much. It's also a great pleasure to have Georges Khalil with us tonight as the introducer of our lecturer. Georges is as the director of the UMI project at the Forum for Trans-Regional Studies and the affiliation it has with the Institute for Advanced Study, or the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin, is a longtime friend of the Academy. Ussama is a former fellow of the Wissenschaftskolleg, as I am also myself, and to have colleagues here from the Wissenschaftskolleg, also from the Freie Universität, from the Barenboim Said Academy. It's a feeling of a real community of scholars and interests and artists around themes of obvious importance to all of us. Let me just say a few words about Georges. This always feels extremely German to introduce the introducer, but our introducers are almost as prominent, if you allow me to say that, as our speakers. So they are worthy of a little bit of time too. As I mentioned, he is responsible for the UMI, or Europe in the Middle East, the Middle East in Europe program. He was previously the coordinator of the working group Modernity and Islam at the Wissenschaftskolleg, and a fellow of the College for International Affairs at the Robert Bosch Foundation. Georges is the editor of a number of books, among them Die Visions, Kultur und Politik des Nahen Ostens, Islamic Art and the Museum, Approaches to Art and Archaeology of the Museum World in the 21st Century, and Commitment and Beyond, Reflections on the political in Arab literature since the 1940s. Following the lecture, we'll have time for questions from all of you, after which we hope you'll join us for a reception in the rooms next door. So welcome again, and Georges, I happily cede the floor to you.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, for the very generous introduction. I'm very embarrassed because I'm not a scholar, I'm an administrator. All those books I co-edited. Exactly. In fact, I wrote something about sectarianism, but it's unpublished. It was my MA thesis, but that was a long time ago. And I'm also embarrassed because there are so many people who know Ussama better than me, who know his work better than me, who know what he's talking about better than me. I'm also a bit confused. First, you corrected it. The original title was A Brief History of Sectarianism in the Arab World, and then was Anti-Sectarianism in the Arab World. Ussama just asked me to explain what sectarianism is, because his talk will not be about sectarianism. So I thought, if I explain what sectarianism isn't, will he then use his brief talk to attack me for the rest of the time? So the title is ambiguous. He himself wrote that sectarianism is ambiguous. I don't also know exactly what sectarianism is. I mean, in German, we use, I think, two concepts to describe something similar but very different. Konfessionalismus und Sektierertum. Both have different connotations. In countries or societies Ussama's writing about, sectarianism is translated as Taifeya. Taifeya also has different connotations than I think what Ussama wants to describe as sectarianism, because the resonance of the word alludes to the linguistic definition of something that is a part of something. It may relate to organizational forms that were present before the advent of modernity, and that by some critics like Yassin Al-Hajj Saleh, for example, he also writes about, who's among us tonight, a Syrian intellectual who also writes about sectarianism, but would write that sectarianism is an ideology, a mechanism that is used by a neo-sultanic state in Syria as a technique of suppression. I think that comes close to what Ussama is speaking about. Ussama, in fact, is Mr. Sectarianism. So if he talks about anti-sectarianism, he will talk about himself, not about me. I mean, his famous book, The Culture of Sectarianism, Community, History, and Violence in 19th-century Ottoman Lebanon was published in 2000, and I think became a classical or the classical reference book for anyone who approaches sectarianism in the Middle East. He published so far 2 other monographs, one entitled Faith Misplaced, The Broken Promise of US-Arab Relations, 1820, 2001, that deals, I think, with one of your passions, the history of American missions, first religious, then later military. I think this is not your passion, but it's the context you live and argue within and against in the Middle East. The book before was on a similar or related topic. It was not written, I think, as a comment to 9/11 and the debates that occurred in the aftermath. I can't read without glasses. Yeah, the title was Artillery of Heaven, American Missionaries and the Failed Conversion of the Middle East. That follows the history of American missions in the multi-religious, multi-ethnic social landscape of Lebanon, Syria, the Levant, through the lens of the dramatic story and of the conversion and the death of Asad Shediak, the lesser-known brother of the famous Ahmed Farid Shediak, one of the first Arab converts to Protestantism, who was martyred after his conversion. His 4th book, I delete in my mentioning all your articles and edited works, is the one you are continuing to write now. It will be entitled, or so far it's the Ecumenical Frame, Coexistence and Sectarianism in the Modern Middle East. It's going to be published in 1 year. So you are interested, Ussama, in questions of religion and difference, in religious sectarian violence, questions of memory and historiography, the relation of religion and politics, not only Lebanon, Palestine, the Levant, and the Eastern Arab world, but also in US or North American Arab relations. I said I apologize in the beginning. I work mainly as an administrator. But as such, I rely on documents too, like a historian. I found the earliest reference to my encounters with Ussama that dates back to the year 1989. No, not 89, 98. 98. 89 is a 98. It was a conference entitled Religion Between Violence and Reconciliation. I remember people already talked about Ussama as this young genius. He was probably 21 then. I was 33. He was already a 1-year professor. 1 year he was the first, for 1 year was the first Arab American Educational Foundation Chair of Arab Studies at Rice University in Houston, Texas. So he gave a talk on the social and cultural meanings of religious violence in 19th century Ottoman Lebanon. This was my first encounter with him. I think he doesn't remember me, but I remember his talk very well. We've met a few years later for, I think, his first visit to Berlin for a conference we had on modernity, or martyrdom and modernity with Friederike Pannewick, where he presented his initial thoughts about his Shediak book. We invited him later to the conference where the book emerged that you mentioned, Michael, Divisions, Culture and Politics of the Middle East, where sectarianism was a crucial topic. It was in 2009. You presented your ideas about sectarianism. Later, you came as a fellow to the Wissenschaftskolleg in 2012-13. That was, I think, a longer period I was able to spend with you. You presented your revision or your comments on your own book 10 years after it was published, I think. in the course of our seminar. Later, I had the privilege to be invited to the place where he usually is, in Houston, Texas, and for a conference on sectarianism, and got some kind of exchanged reward for, I don't know if you remember, our beer garden visit in 2007. So we had a good barbecue also. Not only sectarianism, but also barbecue. I think that is the reconciliation part. The topic of sectarianism, of course, is a sensitive topic to many people. Just this morning, one participant also of this conference in '89, who is also a frequent traveler to Berlin, Elias Khoury, wrote today a column with the question, "Are we still Arabs?" So he addressed the destructiveness of forces as Islamist movements, of sectarian politics, and so on, and called for something also Yassin al-Hajj Saleh calls for in his work on the impossible revolution, a kind of distancing, an intellectual distancing from romantic, from fascist varieties of Arabism and the acceptance of pluralism on the basis of the principle of a secular state for all its citizens. I assume that in that direction Ussama's talk will go. I wonder also what the brief will be. I will be brief in a minute. I will stop in a minute. But I ask myself whether brief means the length of his talk or relates to the brief experience of anti-sectarianism in the Arab world. If we look at the 50s, 60s, and 70s, or maybe early 70s, where anti-sectarianism expressed in broader terms may have prevailed. Yeah, I think this is what I wanted to say. So please, Ussama, the word is yours.
Thank you very much, George, and Michael, and the American Academy, and the staff of the American Academy, and my fellow fellows who've already been subjected to 3 weeks of me. And thank you, of course, to all of you for coming out this evening to listen to what I hope will be a brief lecture about not a brief subject, which is anti-sectarianism. And I'll explain what that means, I hope. Or at least I hope you'll have a sense of what this means by the end of this lecture. So, as George very kindly mentioned, my remarks today are prompted by a pressing concern that has been with me and with many, many people from the Middle East, which is basically how to write a critical history of coexistence at a time, as George just alluded to in the article of Elias Khoury today, at a time of despair in the Arab world and at a time of despair about the Arab world. And my talk, as George also mentioned, draws on my new book manuscript, which is entitled The Ecumenical Frame, Anti-Sectarianism and Coexistence in the Modern Middle East. And it's interesting that the initial title was Sectarianism and Coexistence, and I've changed that. I actually began, as George mentioned, writing this book 5 years ago in Berlin when I was at Vico. And initially, I had wanted to expand on my first book, that is to say, to demythologize or to criticize representations of sectarianism about people killing each other in the Middle East, about age-old, allegedly age-old religious and sectarian identities. And that's what I had initially set out to do. And then I realized as I was writing that book that that didn't satisfy me any longer, in part because I had already addressed this issue in my first book, but also, far more importantly, because I felt, especially in light of what's happened in the region over the past 6-7 years, I felt that it's far more important for me, and hopefully for my readers, to know about the vast archive of human solidarity in the Middle East between peoples of different faiths. And this is an archive that has no proper history, and yet I believe it is absolutely essential for us to make sense of the current region, of the current travails in the region, in the Middle East, by understanding the prehistory to what is happening today. In other words, this archive, as I say, of solidarity between peoples of different faiths. In other words, Muslims, Christians, Jews, and people who don't identify as Muslims, Christians, or Jews. And so my work focuses on the region known as the Mashriq, or the region that in English we sometimes refer to as the Fertile Crescent or the Levant, but in my usage it also includes Egypt and Iraq. And through this book, I want to clarify 3 basic points. So these are my hopes. My first hope is that we can appreciate that the contemporary Arab world, in other words, the region that I'm referring to here as the Mashriq, is not simply the setting for wars and for sectarian violence and for sectarian antagonisms, but it's also a dynamic place where often inspired commitments to cultural and political commonality have emerged in the modern era. In other words, this is a part of the world where people have struggled for a century to actually figure out ways of coexisting that I think we should always bear in mind. Second, to remind us that the struggle for meaningful diversity, equality, and justice remains everywhere a complex and controversial process. In other words, in the Arab world, of course, we see that today, but also here in Germany, also in Britain, in France, and of course, in the United States, where I live and work. In nowhere in the world, in India and so on, nowhere in the world is equality something that we should take for granted. Nowhere is it a finished process, not in the Arab world and not anywhere else. The third hope, finally, is to get beyond writings about the Arab world. And there's been a ton of writing, of course, mostly in Arabic, but also in English and French, and of course in German, that writings that are either obsessed with representing the Arab world as Islamic, in other words, there's this obsession with the fetish of Islamic authenticity, or conversely, writings that mythologize the secular West as a beacon of modern salvation without knowing very much about the actual histories of various Western countries. So these are the 3 hopes that I'm trying to achieve in my book. And I'm acutely aware that my use of the terms ecumenical and anti-sectarian may be confusing at first. They may seem counterintuitive to many of you, given the geopolitical reality of sectarian violence in the contemporary Middle East. Since the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, the coverage of the region, especially in the United States, but I'm sure here in Germany, you can correct me if I'm wrong, has been obsessed with this question of sectarianism. Why do Sunnis and Shi'is allegedly kill each other? Why? Why is there so much sectarian violence? What's wrong with those people in that part of the world? Why haven't they secularized? Why are they still medieval? And so on and so forth. Now, I don't doubt that at all that what we call in English sectarianism is a real problem, insofar as there is violence in the Middle East that does pit different communities against one another. But my point, just to begin this talk, is that sectarianism is no more real and no less subject to change over time than our analogous problems of racism in the United States, or caste politics and communalism in South Asia, or tribalism in Africa. In other words, these are all historical formations. And to write about anti-sectarianism, therefore, is to be reminded of parallel stories of anti-racism in the West, and anti-communalism in South Asia, and anti-tribalism in Africa. It is to be reminded of what observers of the Middle East often forget, that men and women in the region, like men and women everywhere else in the world, have thought deeply and worked passionately to imagine and to try to build better societies. And that's what I want to talk about, the politics of inclusion rather than the politics of exclusion. Like their analogues elsewhere, however, anti-sectarian commitments, in other words, the struggle to emphasize commonality as opposed to difference, like their analogues elsewhere, anti-sectarian commitments often pulled in contradictory directions. They were not necessarily secular, and anti-sectarianism should not be thought of as a cognate for secularism. It's not the same thing. They were often pietistic, and more to the point, they were invariably vitiated by considerations of sovereignty and power. And I'll talk about this towards the end of the talk. I thus propose here in this talk to track the development of anti-sectarianism, again, this will to commonality, first as it developed in the 19th century, mostly as a largely ethical and idealistic discourse, articulated by Arab reformers and intellectuals when Arabs lived under the Ottoman Empire as subjects of the Ottoman Empire. Then I'd like to illustrate how different notions of anti-sectarianism became integral to competing political ideologies of citizenship and nationalism in the post-Ottoman Arab world that was created by European colonialism. So, to begin the story, we have to go back to the 19th century and to the breakdown of one of the great empires of the world, the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman imperial system that had ruled for centuries, as George mentioned, over a vast multi-religious, multi-ethnic, and multilinguistic landscape, including, of course, what we today call the Arab world. Now, this history is known, I know, to some of you, to some of my colleagues here, in its broad outlines. And for those of you who don't know, here is a very quick summary. The Ottoman reforms, known as the Tanzimat, these are the reordering of the empire in the mid-19th century, disestablished the great edifice of symbolic and legal Muslim supremacy in the empire between the years 1839 and 1876. In other words, this had been an Islamic Ottoman empire ruling over non-Muslim subjects and, of course, Muslim subjects. Western powers aggressively claimed in the 19th century their right and their duty to protect Christians in the Orient. There were massive imbalances of military power and trade that led to the opening of Ottoman markets to British textiles and to the dramatic increase of Western missionary movements, both Protestant and Catholic. The rise of a Christian bourgeoisie throughout the empire contrasted with the increasing conscription of Muslim subjects who were sent to go fight and die in many, many wars of the 19th century that the Ottoman Empire fought. And perhaps most important to my argument, in 1856, just remember this one date, as part of the Treaty of Paris that ended the Crimean War, the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Majid conceded, under enormous British pressure, the historic equality of Muslim and non-Muslim subjects for the first time. So this is a watershed moment in the sense that for the first time, an Ottoman Sultan accedes to the equality, in his eyes, of all his subjects, irrespective of their religious affiliation. It was a massive historic change. Now, these changes led, and these shifts led to a massive political and sectarian crisis in the Ottoman Empire, and specifically in Ottoman Syria, triggered directly by conflicting interpretations about the implications of emancipation of non-Muslims. Suffice, and this is a very long and complicated history, let me just give you the bottom line. The bottom line is that by June of 1860, so 4 years after the proclamation of emancipation, by June of 1860, large swaths of predominantly rural Mount Lebanon lay in ruins following sectarian clashes between and among its major communities, Maronite Christians, who are an Eastern Christian Catholic community, and Druze communities. A few weeks later, the largest urban riot in the history of Ottoman Syria took place in July of 1860, when hundreds of mostly Orthodox Ottoman subjects were killed in Damascus, and the Christian quarter of Bab Tuma was reduced to ruin. These massacres of 1860 were, as I said, a watershed moment in the history of coexistence in the Mashriq. I say this because historians have obsessed about this moment in isolation. In other words, people are always obsessed, how could Muslims kill Christians? And this has been sort of the basic thread and the narrative thread of this moment, always emphasizing the idea that Muslims killed Christians and that Christians were victims. And what happened after 1860 is that France sent an army to the east. There was an international commission of inquiry, the first of its kind, that was sent to the Levant to investigate the massacres, and European newspapers and capitals condemned what they called the barbarism of Islam and called for the aid of Christians in the Orient, who in fact were mostly the victims of these riots. That is what the historians and the scholars in the West in particular have covered, and newspapers have covered. But what they've missed is that the events of 1860 also precipitated, and this is why it's important to me now, the first expressions of what I would call, what would become over a century, an Arabic anti-sectarian tradition. In other words, I want to draw your attention to the publication of 11 Arabic epistles that were printed between October 1860 and April 1861, at the same time as the French army was in Syria, at the same time as European and Ottoman diplomats converged on Beirut to restore military and political order. The pamphlets were entitled, as you can see for those of you who know Arabic, they were entitled Nafir Suriya, which means the clarion of Syria, and they were signed at the very bottom, you can barely see that, but at the very bottom, they were signed simply by Muhibb lil Watan, in other words, a patriot, someone who loves the nation. The author of these pamphlets was the printer and writer and missionary Boutros al-Bustani, who was an Arab convert to Protestantism from the Eastern Christian Maronite faith. Bustani, as I said, was also a printer at the American Press in Beirut, which was then a booming multi-religious port city that had become a center of trade, foreign missions, and consulates. Bustani remains until today, for those of you who are not familiar with the history of the Middle East, Bustani remains until today an iconic figure in what is known in Arabic as the Nahda, or the Arabic Renaissance of the 19th century. Now, the most striking aspect of Bustani's printed pamphlets is that they represented an aspirational humanism, a plea to his fellow citizens to sort of rise up above their sectarian passions and understand that they belong to one Syrian nation. So he, in these epistles, he appeals constantly to this imagined community of national readers in Syria at a time when there was no such thing, there was no such state of Syria. And exactly at the moment when European and Ottoman diplomats and military figures were trying to figure out how to separate Muslim from non-Muslim, Bustani is actually pleading for Muslims and non-Muslims, in other words, Christians and Muslims, to actually understand that they had fought what he calls a civil war that implicated all, he said, the sons of the nation, who were, he said, brothers, sons of Adam, and our compatriots. So unlike the evangelical religiosity of his American missionary employers, who had influenced him massively, Bustani, however, drew on allegories and injunctions from both the Bible, as well as alluding to hadith from Muslim hadiths and Quranic verses in these nafirs, to call for a critical and conscious affiliation on the part of all the inhabitants of what he called Syria, Muslims and non-Muslims, to understand, as I said, that they were citizens of one nation. Now, that's, and I'll make, again, it's much more complicated, but let me just say, I do not claim, and I'm not suggesting, that Bustani's fantasy, because this is what it is at this point, it's a fantasy of enlightened ecumenical patriotism, anti-sectarian patriotism. I'm not saying it's more important than the sectarian fears and the animosity stoked by the events of 1860. Clearly, there were sectarian fears. Clearly, there was a lot of trauma as a result of the violence of 1860. Yet precisely because these fears existed, and because the fate of Eastern Christians in particular, in other words, Christians in the Orient, had become a central justification for Western interventionism in the Orient, military interventionism, missionary interventionism, and other political interventionism, it's all the more urgent to appreciate the actual and potential implications of Bustani's nascent anti-sectarianism. In other words, Bustani's writings were one manifestation of the great intersection between an ambiguous Ottomanism, this call for equality of all Ottoman subjects in the eyes of the Sultan, missionary work, which of course influenced Bustani, print capitalism, and Western political, cultural, and economic encroachment. This intersection inadvertently precipitated the emergence of a new ecumenical Arab subjectivity before the creation of a politically independent Arab world. Bustani was not anti-Ottoman. He preached harmony, never equality. He never uses the word equality in any of these epistles. His intent was never to mobilize people for revolution or independence. In other words, by thinking of him as an Arab, we often sort of conflate 20th century politics with 19th century realities. His intent, as I said, was never to mobilize people for revolution or independence. Rather, it was to call for a peaceful aggregation of myriad awakened individuals of different religions who could embody, in his view, through their own agency, what he called a national society that was greater than the sum of its communal parts. And by national, Bustani meant not nationalist, but specifically the coming together of men and women of different faiths in schools in Syria, Palestine, and Mount Lebanon under an Ottomanist rubric. And Bustani opened the very first such school in the Ottoman Empire in Beirut in 1863, and it was called the National School. And again, by national, it means bringing people together from different religious communities without insisting that they convert into one religion, so unlike the missionaries. That Bustani was a Christian is, of course, both entirely significant and at the same time irrelevant to how we should evaluate his importance. It raises a major question about how scholars in the West, in Germany, in the US, in England, in France, routinely signal the religious affiliation of individuals they write about, even when these individuals do not necessarily themselves clearly state or indicate their religious affiliation. So Bustani is often referred to in the literature as a Christian secularist, who preceded other famous Christian Arabs such as Farah Antoun, Khalil Sakakini, Amin Rihani, George Antonius, Edward Said, and so on and so on. Bustani in the Nafir, however, only refers to himself as a patriot. He never refers to himself as a Christian. And we miss a crucial point if we think of his ecumenical commitment, his anti-sectarian commitment, merely as the opening salvo of secular thought that was mimetic of some European Christian original. And far more to the point that I'm making was that Bustani anticipated what happened in the decades after 1860. That is to say, the emergence of a self-consciously didactic and ecumenical class of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish journalists, journal readers, doctors, government employees, engineers, teachers, religious scholars, all of whom believed in their collective ability as, quote, Syrians, Egyptians, Easterners, and also as Muslims, Christians, and Jews to be, quote, civilized. That is to say, to recuperate a common Arabic-Islamic civilization from the perils of ignorance and fanaticism, their terms, ignorance and fanaticism. Thus, what the great Islamic reformer of the 19th century, Muhammad Abdu, some of you will know who he is, he's truly one of the icons of modern Islamic reformist thought, and his major disciple, one of the most important 19th century Islamic figures, Rashid Rida, said in the 19th century, what they said about their ignorant Muslim compatriots, co-religionists, echoed almost exactly what Bustani says about his ignorant Syrian compatriots. The problem, in other words, was not the religious other, the problem was the ignorance of what they called the uncivilized, or those who were uneducated. So I recognize, of course, and I chart this in the book, that Islamic ecumenism of someone like Abdu and Rida was very different and was always in tension with the national ecumenism of someone like Bustani. In other words, Bustani opens a school for all members of peoples of different faiths. Rida and Abdu were far more concerned with Muslims, who were, of course, the overwhelming demographic majority of the population. Yet for all their many differences, I think it's crucial for us to appreciate how quickly the so-called Christian secularists and so-called Islamic reformers took for granted, beginning in 1860 and going all the way through the end of the Ottoman Empire, in other words, the First World War, and in fact beyond the First World War, they took for granted in very different paternalistic idioms the altered political and social meaning of the other in booming cities across the Mashriq, such as Beirut, Cairo, Alexandria, Damascus, Aleppo, and Jerusalem. And incidentally, this is at the time of the Dreyfus Affair in France, the genocide in German Southwest Africa, and of course, Jim Crow segregation across the US South. So I don't mean at all to diminish the existence of deep anxieties and sharp disagreements over such matters about the nature of the modern state in the Mashriq, about missionary schools. There was a huge, vibrant debates about these questions, about the role of Islam in the public sphere, about questions of colonialism, labor, science, constitutionalism, secularism, and women's emancipation. These were, again, these are well-studied, and there were anxieties and contradictions that were evident in the Mashriq, in this region, but also across the Ottoman Empire, and of course, as all of the scholars know, across the world. Everywhere in the world, these questions were debated: constitutionalism, women's emancipation, labor, science, and so on and so forth. Now, what was distinctive about the Mashriq, and this is the point, as opposed to most of the rest of the empire, and especially the Balkans, so what was distinctive about this region here, the Mashriq, this region, as opposed to the northern part of the empire and the Balkans here, was the almost total absence between 1860 and the First World War of burning nationalist, separatist, or colonial questions that methodically separated Muslim from non-Muslim in the Mashriq. In other words, in this region, there was no nationalist question. There was no separatist question. There was no anti-Ottoman, major anti-Ottoman question in the years between 1860 and the First World War. So the 1860 crisis that I talked about at the beginning notwithstanding, there was nothing in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, or the countries that would become Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, or Egypt, that was remotely similar to the existential military or political crises of the Russo-Turkish War that took place in 1877-78, or to the ethnic cleansing that occurred in the Balkans in 1912 and 1913, or to French settler colonialism in Algeria. Instead, what unfolded in the late Ottoman Mashriq, bolstered by the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, was an explosion of competing national and communal, remember, national, not nationalist, and communal Muslim, Christian, and Jewish schools, philanthropic voluntary societies, printing presses, journals, newspapers, and sporting clubs. Almost all of these accepted what the philosopher John Rawls has described as an overlapping consensus, which in this case meant in the Mashriq, which in this case meant the avoidance of controversial topics that might incite sectarian sensitivities, to the acceptance of the key distinction between secular citizenship, Ottoman citizenship, on the one hand, and a highly gendered and religiously segregated regimes of personal status, laws that governed marriage, divorce, and inheritance. So in other words, there was secular citizenship on the one hand, and then everyone else, everybody in the empire was married, inherited, and divorced according to religious laws. And three, political loyalty to the diminished but still evident Ottoman sovereign. So what I'm saying, to make a very long story short, is that the empire bifurcates in the 19th century. The northern part of the empire, here in the Balkans, where Greece becomes independent, then there's a Macedonian question, and then Romania, and Bulgaria, and so on. This area of the empire in the 19th century, between 1860 and the end of the empire, witnesses the rise of nationalism, ethnic cleansing, as Muslims are expelled from this region into Anatolia, and then there's the Turkish response and the rise of an Ottoman Turkish nationalism, which is why the Armenian question and the Armenian genocide takes place during the First World War and not a century before. While all this is happening, while Christians are being massacred here, Armenians are being massacred here, and Muslims are being expelled from the Balkans, in this part of the empire, the Arab, what we today call the Arab world, the Arab Mashriq, there is no nationalist question. What there is, in fact, is what I call the ecumenical frame. This culture of coexistence that is deeply complex, full of contradictions, full of illusions, that takes place under a diminished but still capable Ottoman sovereignty. So that's really basically the story up until the First World War. It's a story that Ottomanists should know but don't know, because Ottomanists tend to study either the Balkans or the Arab region, and rarely do they study the entire empire in terms of questions of coexistence. So that's the basic history. All this changes, in a sense, after the First World War. The Ottoman Empire is defeated. The British, as all of you, of course, know, divide up with the French, the Ottoman Empire, into various mandatory states. So this region, the Arab Mashriq, which had been under Ottoman sovereignty and where the ecumenical frame had developed between 1860 and the First World War, where there was no nationalist question, where Muslim and Christian elites had sort of developed this culture of coexistence that was, of course, elitist and extraordinarily condescending to peoples of the lower classes. This ecumenical frame was overtly politicized after the First World War by virtue of European colonialism. And of course, all of you know that the Europeans colonized the Arab world. What few people realize is that the colonialism that the Arab world was subjected to, the Mashriq, was subjected to after the First World War, was one of the last instances of European colonialism. And the Arab world was the first place, as far as I'm aware, that was colonized in the name of self-determination. And the paradox and the ironies of that are worth keeping in mind. In September 1920, France established its mandate over Maronite Christian-dominated Greater Lebanon. So the state of Lebanon that exists today was created by the French in 1920, and specifically to separate Christian Mount Lebanon or Christian Lebanon from the rest of Syria. The French also divided Ottoman Syria into, which had not been separated in this manner, but the French divided Ottoman Syria into Alawite, Druze, and Syrian Muslim states. The British, of course, legitimated Zionism in Palestine, in the Mandate of Palestine, through the Balfour Declaration of 1917. And in 1921, Britain installed in Baghdad King Faysal, who had been king of Syria. They installed him in Baghdad as their sort of client king over this new mandate of Iraq. In line with the paternalistic logic of Article 22 of the newly established League of Nations, Britain and France claimed that their presence in the Orient was indispensable for the protection of religious freedom and for the prevention and the hegemony of Muslim Arabs over non-Muslim minorities. And the Europeans were obsessed in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, with this idea of minorities. And what interests me here is not to retell a story that many of you are familiar with, of colonial divide and rule. I can talk about that later if you wish. But I just want to point out one thing. Britain and France obsessively encouraged minoritarian separatist consciousness, exactly to the degree that the Ottoman state had fought against separatist minoritarian consciousness. In any case, the demise of a unitary Ottoman fragile sovereignty introduced not only new states with new borders, so Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, which becomes Israel, of course, Iraq, and Jordan, and Transjordan, but also new ideologies in the 1920s. Arabism, Phoenicianism, Syrianism, Pan-Islamism, Zionism, and so on. These in turn forced every former Ottoman subject to make a basic choice about how he or she was to identify with their new environment. There was a massive difference, in other words, between thinking of oneself in this period as a Christian Arab or as a Christian minority in the Muslim majority Arab world. And that's why these terms are so sensitive until today. Between thinking of oneself politically as an Arab nationalist or thinking of oneself as a pan-Islamist. Between thinking of oneself as a Zionist Jew or thinking of oneself as an Arab Jew. These are hugely important choices that everyone, in a sense, has, or different people have to make. The integrity of the surviving ecumenical frame depended utterly on how this particular question of affiliation was resolved. Inevitably, perhaps, there was no consensus about where precisely the line between religion and politics should be drawn, or whether the great historic and social reality of religious diversity in the Mashriq should have any contemporary political significance. In other words, should you take the fact that people are religiously different and then inscribe that religious difference in formal politics, or should you create secular states such as the United States? These were the questions that people had to debate in the 1920s, all under a European colonial frame. Thus, among the various mandate states created by European imperial fiat, it was only in the Maronite Christian-dominated Lebanon that political sectarianism, that is, the formalization of religious difference in modern politics, where you divide up cabinet posts according to religious affiliation, was enshrined under French colonial auspices. And here, this is one of the most striking photographs of the proclamation of Grand Liban, Greater Lebanon, in September 1920. And of course, you see the French High Commissioner sitting right there, flanked by two religious figures, one a Maronite Christian and the other a Muslim. And the idea, of course, is that France here is the indispensable sort of figure that mediates between Muslims and Christians, even though, as I've said, for 60 years beforehand, there had been this ecumenical frame developing without France. But anyway, in this new state of Lebanon, Christian elites generally favored the French mandate, which had incorporated coastal cities and agriculturally rich areas with large Muslim populations in order to make the new country of Lebanon economically viable. The most famous proponent of political sectarianism was a Francophone, pro-Christian, pro-French, Chaldean Christian banker, essayist, newspaper owner, one-time member of parliament by the name of Michel Chiha, who drafted Lebanon's 1926 constitution. Today, Chiha is often dismissed as a right-wing fanatic, as the face of a merchant republic of Lebanon, dominated then as now by a cross-confessional oligarchy of bankers, merchants, and feudal lords who exploit the common people. Yet to me, Chiha's importance lies in how he elaborated a deeply conservative notion yet also a compelling one to many of his Muslim peers about what the Dutch political scientist Aaron Liphart would later famously describe as consociational democracy. So I'll explain what that means. In the face of dissenting voices, and there were dissenting voices in the 1920s, who warned about the dangers of political sectarianism, about inscribing religious difference in formal politics, creating sectarian calculus. Formally, sort of in the US terms, it's like making black and white and Latino formal terms in government division, as opposed to understanding that there are these divisions without actually inscribing them in politics. There were many people who criticized this sort of political sectarianism. Shia insisted that there was no other way to create a stable country that involved and included multiple religious communities. He insisted that religious passions in the Middle East, this is Shia in the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, he said that religious passions in the Middle East were far too authentic, far too entrenched in the political and social fabric of the Middle East to absorb abstract theories of Western liberalism and socialism that were beginning to make inroads in the region following the Russian Revolution. Shia claimed that these religious passions had to be contained urgently through rational, elitist, communal representation in parliament. He thus crafted one of the most profoundly ambiguous constitutional articles in any Arab constitution, and probably in any constitution anywhere, the infamous Article 95 of the Lebanese constitution, which legitimated a formal sectarian or communal calculus for high office and cabinet posts for a temporary period. This is 1926, in the name of national harmony. So Shia's communalist vision of the state, was predicated on this idea that you come together for a temporary period, we divide cabinet posts on religious lines for a temporary period, only insofar as it leads to national harmony. This was the idea, this was the vision. And the idea, of course, attracted Muslim and Druze elites, fellow members of parliament, precisely because it explicitly rejected Shia's constitution, and the Lebanese constitution and the Lebanese state explicitly rejected an exclusivist Christian state. So Lebanon is not a Christian state constitutionally. It is a state for all its citizens, but it divides cabinet posts and parliament along religious lines, allegedly for a temporary period. So that's the sectarian system. At the heart of this system was what Shia described as a philosophy of communalism or sectarianism. And there was this distinction that he made between what he claimed was the medieval and blind sectarian allegiance and fanaticism and what he called his modern anti-sectarian communalism and a communalist formula for coexistence. So in other words, Shia distinguished between a necessary, vital, and historic balance of what he called associated communities to rule a multi-confessional polity on the one hand and a destructive sectarianism of the masses on the other. Shia, in short, believed that Lebanon's confessional, religious, and secular elites had a shared duty to guide otherwise irrational and ignorant population and to rid the population over a very gradual process of their sectarian passions. And so this was the great sort of formula that he came up with. Temporary, allegedly temporary, although the system continues until today, sectarian calculus on the basis that Lebanon is a state for all its citizens and that it is not a Christian exclusivist state. The problem, of course, is, for those of you who know Lebanon and know the Middle East, the problem is that this sort of notion of coexistence privileges communities over individual citizens. In other words, the notion of coexistence is never about individuals. It's always about communities. So community X and community Y, and never about individuals vis-a-vis the tyranny of the state. So communities are always privileged over individuals. That's one problem. The other problem, of course, is that Shia and all those who defended this sectarian formula, as opposed to those who called for a secular state, a truly secular state, is that Shia consistently obscured the fact that every community has within it class, gender, geographic, and generational diversity, and there's no such thing as a community with just one head. There's no such thing as a monolithic community. He ignored the fact that his country's political system habitually favored Maronite Christians over Muslims by granting the most powerful posts in the country to the Maronites, the presidency, the head of the army, and so on. He overlooked the crucial fact that Lebanon had been pieced together by the coercive power of French colonialism, and not by the will of its own population. He rejected the necessity of a national educational system. He believed that foreigners, missionaries, and so on, should continue to dominate Lebanon's educational system. And most of all, he refused to see what was most glaringly obvious to the many contemporary critics of the communal system, the sectarian system of Lebanon, that he had designed. In other words, rather than being temporary, as his constitution called for, sectarianism or communalism was constantly reproduced within the state through sectarian electoral lists, through polling stations where you as a citizen go vote as a Christian or as a Muslim or as a Jewish person in various polling stations, through personal status laws that deny the possibility of secular marriage inside the country. And this, of course, led to or helped contribute to a paralyzed Lebanese state that has only been ever able to conduct one population census, and that back in 1932. Since then, the state cannot conduct a population census because of the sectarian alleged balance. So if you find out what the people actually, how many people are there, the whole system allegedly crumbles. So that's the country. So yes, there is coexistence, but it is deeply anti-republican, and it is, as I've tried to explain, problematic on any number of levels. Now, the flip side of Shiha's pro-colonial communalist project was the mass of anti-sectarian, anti-colonial writings and oppositional politics that emerged both in Lebanon itself and in the Muslim-majority Arab mandates of Iraq and Syria, as well as in Egypt. If Shiha indefinitely put off answering the question of how an explicitly communalist system was meant to arrive at an anti-sectarian future, because that is the promise of the Lebanese state. We're supposed to arrive eventually at an anti-sectarian future by installing sectarian structures. But it's never clear how we're supposed to get there. If that's the problem in the Lebanese case, in the rest of the Arab world, overtly anti-colonial nationalist politics in Syria, Iraq, and Egypt claim to be already anti-sectarian, and yet consistently elided precisely who, where, and how the imperatives of national unity and anti-sectarianism were going to be reconciled. The tensions in the practice of nationalist anti-sectarianism, in other words, what we call today Arab nationalism, became especially evident in the work of Sata al-Husari, who's my other major figure, who was the first Director General of the Ministry of Education in British-created Hashemite Iraq. Now, Husari think of him as like the foil to Shiha. Husari was descended from an Aleppan family, long in the service of the Ottoman Empire. He was and had been a major Ottoman pedagogue. If Shiha reflected one strand of the cosmopolitanism of late Ottoman modernity in the Mashriq, that it so favored Christians in the Mashriq at the same time as the Armenians had been massacred. Husari, who began his career as a secular, modernizing Ottomanist pedagogue, stationed in the Balkans and then in Istanbul, tried to reproduce the Ottoman Empire, but on a much smaller scale of Iraq. Although today often labeled a Sunni, and that's the irony of where we are today, he's often referred to today as a Sunni, bigot, the irony is that Husari invested heavily in making apparent the link between meaningful self-determination and what he said over and over again was the absolute necessity of producing anti-sectarian citizens. The stakes in his view could not have been higher. Iraq, after all, in 1923, was a country that had no defined borders, and was confronted by Turkish and Iranian claims to much of its territory and to many of its would-be citizens. Kurds and Assyrians in the north, and several Shia tribal leaders and religious figures and notables in the overwhelmingly Shia south, often resisted the still new idea of secular Iraqi nationality, tied to a very tenuous pro-British Hashemite sovereign, King Faysal. From his urban perch in Baghdad, Husari, this man, was confronted by what he saw, and what was in fact an overwhelmingly illiterate, rural, and impoverished population. So the question for him was, how then do we develop? How do you make Iraq a sovereign state? And his way, since he was a pedagogue, was to build a national educational system. And that's what he did. And he became famous for it. He built what he called the Manhaj al-Watani, this national curriculum that he introduced in 1923. And he did it specifically to overcome what he called sectarian passions that separated Iraqis of different faiths from one another. He thus viewed the traditional Quranic schools as well as European-supported minority schools as two sides of the same sectarian coin. Under his watch, although remember today he's always referred to as a Sunni, the irony is that under his watch a far greater percentage of the national budget was funneled to education than the British colonial overlords had thought necessary. He reduced both religious and foreign language instruction in schools that he created in Iraq. He introduced an Arabic primer, an Arabic language book for children without the word Allah for the first time. He adopted new national textbooks that secularized Iraq's Islamic heritage. He massively increased female education at both primary and secondary levels. He hired teachers from across the Mashriq to indoctrinate students in the belief that they were simultaneously citizens of Iraq and at the same time members of the Arab world. So yes, this was indoctrination. But for Husari, this was the only way to achieve a modern sovereign state. He introduced compulsory national education of children of all socioeconomic classes, exactly the opposite of Shia in Lebanon, who didn't believe in national education. And he believed that this indoctrination of students was meant to lead to a revolution in the manners and customs and eventually the politics of Iraq. This was going to lead to sovereignty. He did not want stability, he wanted revolution in terms of how people thought about who they were and how they related to the rest of the world. At stake in Husari's anti-sectarianism was a secular anti-colonial urgency that had 20th century analogues in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and of course among African-American critics of racial segregation, such as W.E.B. Du Bois. The Americanists will know who he is. The problem of this urgency was that it changed the temporality of sectarian fanaticism from being a problem of self that could be gradually overcome, as Bustani had thought about it initially in the 19th century, to being a problem of traditional others who had to be hauled into modernity by the power of a secular, modernizing state. The more fundamental problem was that in Iraq in the 1920s and 30s, there was no such powerful, modernizing, secular state. Husari's anti-sectarian urgency, he was obsessed with this anti-sectarianism, worked at cross purposes to his patron, the king of Iraq, who wanted stability, not revolution. He wanted to make sure things remained calm. Faysal, after all, depended on Britain's military power. He accepted British military advisors. He had no choice. He accepted British-mandated tribal laws. He accepted an electoral law that guaranteed minority representation, and what would soon become the Iraq Petroleum Company, dominated by foreign interests. And the king sought to co-opt major land-owning Shi'i tribal leaders, clerics, and urban notables in the south, who themselves made communal demands, sectarian demands on the resources of the state in the name of national equity. So that by the late 1920s, the Minister of Education in Iraq, in other words, who worked over Saad al-Husari, was invariably appointed from the Shi'i community, and who often then immediately tried to, of course, build patronage networks in the schools for members of the Shi'i community of Iraq. And Husari himself said, this is outrageous. This is unacceptable because sectarian patronage goes exactly against what we're trying to build in Iraq. Now, from the standpoint of Husari, it was outrageous. From the standpoint of his many critics in Iraq in the 1920s and 1930s, Husari's emphasis on national unity, rooted in an inculcated modernist anti-sectarian Arabism, was itself suffused with arrogance and cultural violence. Husari, after all, was not from Iraq. Remember, he worked in the Ottoman Empire, he worked in the Balkans, he was originally from Syrian, and his Arabic had a marked Turkish accent until his death in 1968. And although Husari grudgingly conceded that Kurds of Iraq, for example, could be Arabized, he betrayed in all his writings and almost all his speeches a fundamental lack of empathy to their cultural, political, and linguistic aspirations. So Kurds could be Arabized, but they could never have independence. Unlike Shiha's communalist outlook in Lebanon, that celebrated religious diversity but obscured the violence of French colonialism, which is what almost all Lebanese defenders of the sectarian system do, Husari's Arabism consistently obscured diversity in the name of overt anti-colonialism. Husari thus contributed directly to an Arabic political vocabulary, or I should say an Arab political vocabulary of anti-sectarianism that we still see today, that is largely unable and unwilling to deal with the question of religious and ethnic difference, except in the most brittle of terms. There's a taboo on investigating things that are deemed sectarian. There is a refusal to acknowledge the implications of what does it mean that equality was introduced at the point of European bayonets in the 19th century, in 1856. there is a refusal to acknowledge that virtually every Arab constitution, except for Lebanon's constitution, very clearly indicates the primacy of Muslims over non-Muslims in terms of making Islam either the religion of the state or the head of the state being Muslim. These are some of the taboos. We can talk about these a little later. But before we judge Husari too harshly, it's worth recalling the following point, and I'm getting to the end here, so don't worry. Unlike Shia, Husari, this man, enjoyed no colonial support. Indeed, his own dogmatic commitment to anti-sectarian idealism, to the idea of saying we can build a sovereign state by sort of covering up differences. His anti-colonialism saw him pushed out of power in Iraq by 1931. He was then humiliated in 1932 when the Iraqi government invited an American educational commission, the Monroe Commission, to Iraq to advise the Iraqi state about how to set up an educational, a national educational system. And this commission basically undid or advocated undoing virtually all of Husari's school systems. In other words, he had built a national public educational system. They said you need to sort of separate it out. He had wanted women, girls to be educated, and the Americans said, no, no, you shouldn't educate girls in science, you need to educate them in home economics and these kinds of things, and so on and so forth. And so, of course, he was aghast, but he had been pushed out of power, and in 1941, he's exiled from Iraq. He was then invited to Syria, post-independence Syria, where he shapes Syria's national curriculum, which remains in place, or at least in theory, until today. And in the 1940s, he was condemned by the Muslim Brotherhood, or Islamists in Syria, for being like a secularist, even though today he's often referred to, as I said, as a Sunni. So he then becomes an educational advisor to the Arab League in Cairo, and he dies, as I said, in 1968. His dream of a unified secular Arab nation apparently shattered for good. So the great question that Arabs debate today is whether the dream of anti-sectarian unity, the idea of saying Muslim and Christian, and for a while at least, Jewish Arabs, could actually belong to one political community. This idea, in other words, that's being debated today, the question is, was it always an untenable, dangerous fantasy doomed to failure? Or rather, was it a political project that failed for specific contingent reasons, including, of course, something that I haven't talked about at all today, but I'm happy to talk about more, incessant Western interventionism in the region throughout the 20th century until this very moment. The other question is, what, if anything, can be salvaged or might be salvaged from the anti-sectarian threads of communalist and nationalist projects without repeating their fundamental flaws and denials? In other words, what was good from the Lebanese project and from the Arab nationalist projects? What can we salvage from these projects as we think about the Arab world of today and tomorrow? And the irony is that today, despite a brutal civil war that devastated the country between 1975 and 1990, the Lebanese model of communalism, sectarianism, has been proposed by a succession of US leaders as the most natural solution for Iraq and Syria's current geopolitical crisis. In other words, create a sectarian system in Syria and Iraq, because that's the only way we're being told that people of different religions, different communities can actually coexist. President Obama, just 2 years ago, in fact, declared egregiously that, quote, the only organizing principle in the region is a sectarian one, end quote. Or I'm paraphrasing, but it's something along those lines. Some scholars who allegedly are experts on the Middle East today tell us that the fundamental problem of the Middle East is diversity. In other words, it's not that there's politics and there's a question of competition for resources. It's the problem is that you have Muslims and Christians and Kurds and Alawis and so on and so forth all together. And what you really need to do is you need to sort them all out, which is absurd, especially coming from American scholars, given the history of race relations in the United States. But anyway, last point is that almost no thought is given to the fact that Shia and Husari represent rival, and this is perhaps the most fundamental point of the book, is that despite these differences between these two men, Husari, who was an educator, and Shia, who was a constitutionalist and a sort of an essayist, one who defends the sectarian system, one who was completely opposed to a sectarian, tried to create a secular nationalist system. Both these men ultimately represented rival politicizations of a shared ecumenical heritage. That's the most important point. They both come out of an Ottoman milieu, and they politicize it in very different ways in the post-Ottoman context. In other words, what's significant for us to remember is that for at least a century after 1860, in other words, from 1860 to 1967 at least, different forms of anti-sectarian commitment were understood to be vitally important for the future of the region. So Shia, who creates a sectarian system, justifies the system as the best way of reaching an anti-sectarian future. The contrasting fortunes of Shia and Husari coincided with the emergence across the Mashriq in the 1930s and 40s and 50s with genuinely radical anti-sectarian groups, social movements, and revolutionary parties that drew cadres from nearly all religious communities of the region, whether communist parties, trade unions, or even the initial idea behind the now discredited secular pan-Arab Ba'ath Party in Syria, whose founders, of course, were a Muslim and a Christian. The mainstream nationalist parties in Egypt, Syria, Iraq, elite women's movements, as well as the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which of course was founded in the 1920s, all insisted that non-Muslims were not minorities but full citizens. So to be anti-sectarian in the post-Ottoman era in the Arab world clearly did not suggest a simple commitment to secularism, let alone to radical politics of land reform, democracy, social justice, or gender equality. But to be anti-sectarian did inform a panoply of competing, contending, political, religious, and cultural Arab identifications, all of which fought a war of positions within the ecumenical frame, but not against it. Finally, the very different answers provided by different Arabs as to how best to reconcile the imperatives of equality, diversity, and sovereignty reminds us that there was no Arab equivalent to the draconian power enjoyed by Mustafa Kemal in Turkey, the founder of the Turkish Republic. At least not until the mid-1950s, when revolutions swept away monarchies in Egypt and Iraq. This mid-century era of decolonization inaugurated a new chapter in the story of anti-sectarianism, one that was at the time full of hope, but also that carried within it seeds of tragedy. Whether in Iraq, Palestine, Syria, or most famously in Nasser's Egypt, the commitment to anti-sectarianism became an ineluctable aspect of revolutionary mobilizations, secular and Islamist, whose history remains to be written. In the same era, however, the conjoined tropes of anti-sectarianism and anti-colonialism began to be deployed in the arsenal of despotic national security states that today so disfigure the modern Middle East. In other words, what began in the 19th century as genuine ecumenical commitments and that continued into the 20th century as genuine commitments on the part of people to combat division, sectarianism, difference, have often degenerated into a debased language of anti-sectarianism that consolidates brutal state power. We see this, of course, in Syria, we saw this in Iraq, and we see this in many other countries as well. And of course, what we have to not lose sight of is the origins of this anti-sectarianism and not just focus on how states manipulate this language. The question for me is, why the language in the first instance? And why is it important? So we need in the final analysis an honest reckoning. We still need, I think, an honest reckoning with the history of pluralism and diversity in the Middle East. And I don't think we've had one up until this point. We need to know more about how ordinary men and women in the region have grappled with the contending pulls of equality, religion, and unity amidst imperial geopolitics in which they, in other words, the people of the region, have never been the major players. We also need to follow parallel and vexed histories of pluralism in other parts of the world. How did the United States deal with pluralism? What about Germany, since we're here? What about India? What about African states? What about other Asian states? And so on, to remind us always that the Arab world is not this unique place out there. It's part of a world where we're all dealing more or less with similar issues. What we don't need is displays of self-flagellation on the part of many disillusioned Arab intellectuals who are always today saying, you know, the problem is that the Arabs failed or that we're backwards or we're behind the West and so on, because that fundamentally doesn't actually help and it doesn't actually understand anything about the history of the West. What we need is not saying how bad we are. What we need is more criticism. And in fact, if anything, I'd like to refer to the great literary critic Edward Said, who in fact called for, throughout his life until his death in 2003, revitalized secular criticism, which is not to say anti-religious criticism, but secular criticism in the true sense of the word. That is to say, to remind us all that we're not trapped, as Said said over and over again, we're not trapped in culture, we're also social actors on culture. One must believe, in other words, in the possibility of a better society if one has any chance of building such a society. And this holds, as far as I can tell, as much for the struggle against racism in the West as it does for the struggle against sectarianism in the Middle East. So thank you very much.
We have time for some questions, and there'll be a microphone brought to you.
Thank you very much. It was an incredibly enlightening story about our region and how we deal with it from the Middle East and from the West perspective. I'm going to try as much as possible to keep my questions short, but it's a bit jumbled right now.
Can you identify who you are for people to know?
Hi, I'm Mina Hanna. Should I say more, or is that it's okay? Okay, I'm Mina. Nice to meet you. The first thing is I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, as you alluded in the beginning of your lecture, to this kind of persistent negativity of the portrayal of the Middle East from the West, especially in Western media. And I mean, I read about this, of course, in Said's Covering Islam, that was written after the Iranian hostage crisis, how, you know, this is a continuation of a kind of Orientalist language that has its origins in the 19th century. So I wonder if you could talk about that and contextualize it in your comments on anti-sectarianism. And then I also had questions about Shia and Sati al-Husri, that I like how they are sort of poles of what has come since then, especially in Lebanon, a state that is paralyzed by sectarianism as it has been politically enshrined, and as al-Husri, who is this father of what I think eventually became kind of a pan-Arab secularism. Did he have any connection with Nasser when he was living in Egypt up until 1965? Is there actually a sort of real intellectual link to Nasser's ideas? And the last question, I promise this is the very last.
I've forgotten the first one, but anyway.
There is an idea, and this is much more about the Coptic population in Egypt, and so it's a little left of field, but it's still part of the region, as you described. There was an idea that came out of the late 19th and early 20th century about how the Coptic population is kind of the inheritor of the ancient pharaonic kind of tradition, and they're the original pharaonic peoples. And I've actually read this idea being, this idea has been sort of propagated and supported by Western scholars, especially in the first half of the 20th century. So if you could talk about that in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot to talk about. So let me be as brief, because I went a little too long, let me be brief and answer, let me go with the first part of your first question, which is how does Western American representations of the Middle East? I mean, yes, of course, the United States represents all cultures, all foreign cultures, including its own culture, in extraordinarily simplistic ways. The Middle East, the coverage has been insidious in the relentless coverage of a sectarian Middle East. Almost every article begins with Sunni and Shia, and they tell you that this goes back to the beginnings of Islam. You know, and of course, they would never say the same when they talk about Europe or European. They never talk about what happened 1500. They never do that. But when the Middle East, there's always this idea that we are just witnessing a repetition of an age-old sectarian religious problem, as if what's happening today is a religious problem as opposed to a political problem about resources, about the capture of the state, about justice, about equality, and so on and so forth. And so what I tell my students in the United States, in Texas, I say, just imagine for a moment, you live in Texas, you have Latinos, you have, and this is, for those of you who don't live in Texas, I'm sorry, but this is how I explain sectarianism to my American students. I always tell them, just imagine Texas, you have Latinos, you have African Americans, you have Anglos, whites, and you have all these other communities. Just imagine what would happen if I came in and removed the central state, that removed even the idea of a secular state, removed the army, removed everything, despite how terrible the military-industrial complex is. And I said, you know, what do you think would happen in Texas or any other? I mean, you would see what would happen. There's sectarianism, or these things are not about age-old anything. This is about sort of contemporary struggles over resources, questions of justice, questions of equity and equality, and so on and so forth. There's nothing unusual about the Middle East. We don't need to talk about an age-old thing. On the other hand, it's also important not to romanticize the history of coexistence in the Middle East by pretending that things were, people often in the Middle East tell you, oh yeah, we had coexistence, but they always forget to tell you there may have been coexistence, but there was no secular equality. That is a modern phenomenon in the Middle East and everywhere else. So that's my short answer. In other words, everywhere in the world, in Germany, in France, in Britain, in India, everywhere, equality is a very difficult process. It's always ongoing. It's always interrupted. You always have setbacks. And so in the Middle East as well. There's nothing to be ashamed of, in other words. And there's nothing to cover up. It's the opposite, I think. I don't remember the other parts. Oh, Husari. Husari, well, of course, he's exiled from Iraq. And he ends up, and that's a whole other story, which I won't get into now, in 1941. But of course, remember, Husari was a genuine idealist. He was extremely difficult in the sense that he really believed in his vision. And so insofar as the Nasserist state, was the setting for the Arab League, he worked there, but he was never a supporter of, as far as I can tell. I have to do more work on this, but I don't think he was ever a supporter of the idea of, of any kind of system that did not ultimately lead to an anti-sectarian. His emphasis was always on national anti-sectarian discourse. Insofar as Nasser claimed that that's what the Egyptian revolution was all about, then there would have been symmetry, at least some kind of. But in the end, of course, he dies in 1968, and his dreams of pan-Arab unity utterly crushed. And the question is then, what do we take from this dream? Do we say it was all a fiction, a fantasy? Or do we say, actually, there was something quite powerful, without repeating all the elisions and silences, this is what you were alluding to earlier, of Arab nationalism of the 1950s and 40s and 50s and 60s, in other words, that denied diversity in the Arab world itself, that had a very difficult time talking about diversity. So that, in Egypt, we were talking about Egypt earlier, George and I. In Egypt, yes, this gets to your question of Copts. In Egypt, yes, Copts are citizens, and they came up with this whole thing of being the original Egyptians, but that's not the point. The point is that they said consistently that they're citizens of Egypt, they're not a minority. And yet, in Egypt, George was telling me correctly that in Egypt until today, to build a church, you still need a presidential permit, which tells you that there's something fundamentally wrong in this kind. That the idea of equality, what does this mean? These things need to be interrogated and talked about honestly and openly. Again, yeah.
Hello, I'm David Knudsen. Thank you very much. This is very interesting, but now I'm really confused.
Okay.
You mentioned a natural solution. Do you believe there is one? I mean, a natural solution? You mentioned it before, and at the end you said some things that we could be doing. But what should be the goals here? Is it Husari's goal? What are the goals? What should they be? Do you believe it's possible?
Do I believe what's a solution?
A natural solution.
I don't think I said natural. Maybe I misspoke. But I didn't say natural solution. I said that, what people are working for in the Arab world is what people are working for, as far as I can tell, everywhere else in the world. Okay? insofar as there are, I mean, the difference in the Arab world is that you have the United States and you have all sorts of other forces that are involved. You have despotic regimes. You have, you know, it's an extraordinarily, it is a complex situation. So what am I calling for? First, I'm calling for an understanding of the history of this region, to understand that this region was not only consumed, or not even necessarily primarily consumed by sectarian antagonisms. There was an entirely other history that basically was overwhelmed post-1967 by all sorts of other factors. In fact, the creation of Israel it's a major part of my book. I didn't talk about this in the talk, but the idea of creating a Jewish state in a region that is multi-religious, as you can imagine, had all sorts of reverberations for the Palestinians, for the idea of being Arab Jews, for the Iraqi Jewish community, for Jewish communities throughout the Arab world. So one of the things I ask in the book is, why is it that Arab and Jew today are antithetical categories when a century ago there was no need for that? There was absolutely no way to think, why would you think of Arab and Jew as antithetical? Today people routinely talk about an Arab-Jewish conflict as if these are two antithetical categories. So what I'm trying to explain in the book is, how do we end up there? And what is the relationship between that and Husari and Shia and all these other people? That's what I'm really trying to get at.
Yeah, thanks. That was really super interesting. Let's see. So I'm not a historian, and I work mostly on European literature and philosophy, so that may be coming at this totally the wrong way. I was curious to know, are there places, I mean, either conceptually or empirically, where what you see isn't really, or the opposition sectarianism, anti-sectarianism isn't quite adequate because the phenomena is more complicated? And the reason I ask is because you started by distinguishing anti-sectarianism from liberalism, or from secularism, excuse me. And the secular model would imply a kind of neutralization of differences, right? In some allegedly neutral instance like reason or the state or something like that. Whereas, so I see if we have one extreme, we have liberal neutralization, other extreme, we have so-called sectarian violence. I'm wondering if there's something in the middle, right, or maybe coexistence that involves more like a politics of difference that's neither neutralization nor violence, right? It might so I guess what I want to push you on a bit is how to conceptualize that positively, actually, as the cultivation of differences that might have a moment that, in a sense, is sectarian. I mean, that it involves emphasizing difference and trying to conceptualize this positively, not trying to conceptualize it neutrally as something to be tolerated or limited.
Correct. Yeah, so that's a good question, and I tried to answer that. I wasn't clearly. So, but my answer to that is, it's called the ecumenical frame, and my point is that in the 19th century, what you have in the Ottoman case, especially in the Mashriq, but actually throughout the empire until the Balkan Wars, is that you do in fact have what you're calling for, like a recognition of difference, not a secular state as in a state that imposes secularization on all its citizens. The opposite, in fact. What you have in the Ottoman case, in fact, continues into the Middle East, throughout the Arab world and Israel until today, which is a consistent separation of secular citizenship from sectarian personal status laws. In other words, laws of marriage, divorce, and inheritance, which are adjudicated by your religious community. So in the Middle East, there is never this idea of the totalizing secular state that completely effaces and obscures difference is not the case in the Middle East. That's my answer, and that's my attempt. In other words, the problem, of course, there are problems with that, because that's always inherently in the case of the Middle East. What you end up doing is that you end up in almost every instance preventing secular. I mean, it's very difficult to sort of entrench a secular concept of citizenship when the most important things in your life, secularity doesn't actually hold. In marriage, divorce, and inheritance, you're not a secular. So you are a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew or a Sunni or a Shia or whatever. And so there's real problems with that. And I think to answer the last point I'll make is to remind that any discussion about difference, whether you tolerate difference or acknowledge difference, is predicated always on the question of sovereignty, which is really the most important aspect of this. In the United States, almost all the criticisms of secularism and the secular state are premised whether consciously or unconsciously, on the idea that there's a very powerful United States. And so you can do whatever you want, but in the end, there's a state that's going to protect you. The question is, what happens in societies and states where you don't have these powerful sovereignties? You can't take that for granted. How then do you try to acknowledge difference? On what terms, at what expense? And will the state still be there when you're done acknowledging difference? On the other hand, when you suppress difference, what happens then? So I think... There's some more. Oh, okay.
I'm Amy Remensnyder. I'm a medieval historian, as will become obvious in a second. So I have two very quick questions, sorry. The first one is, I'm wondering how much the ecumenical frame is a product of political, cultural, intellectual elites. In the end, you invoked ordinary men and women, but you mostly focused on politicians, intellectuals, etc. And the other question is, you used the word medieval twice, both terms negatively.
Yeah.
And I just wondered
I apologize.
How the very rich, long tradition in the Islamicate world of both the Middle Ages and the early modern period, in which, as you know, there's been enormous scholarship, which is a tradition of living together that is not predicated on equality, but where people still live together, if some of these figures are aware of that heritage and drawing on that. So it is a radical departure in the 19th century because of equality. But these longer traditions, I'm wondering how you acknowledge those.
Yeah, I think that's Amy, first of all, I apologize to you. As a medievalist, I love medievalists or I love medieval history. That's not, I mean, I don't mean it in a negative way. I mean it in a positive way in the sense that I'm always reacting to the fact that when it comes to the Middle East, the coverage is always that, the medieval period and the modern period are basically the same. So who's the most famous, or in the 20th century, the most famous, so-called expert on the Middle East? Bernard Lewis was a medievalist by training. And the idea is that you don't need to be, modern and medieval, it's all the same, so you can talk about it basically in the same terms. And I find that objectionable. So it's not to say that I find medieval history objectionable, not at all. And in fact, these people, Saad al-Husari and Shiha, and almost anyone who is in the region, understands precisely this medieval heritage. And of course, they romanticize it. And they gloss over all the inequality. They gloss over the often extraordinary episodes of violence. These become, sort of, in a sense, taboo subjects. But they certainly understand that there is something that's quite interesting about this part of the world. That is to say, this Islamic heritage, because it's one that can actually include, when you re-narrate it and rethink it and romanticize it, you can, in that process, include peoples of different faiths. And some of the most sort of, famous scholars, or some of the most famous scholars of medieval Arab history, of course, are non-Muslims, Arabs who are actually invested in this precisely because they understand that this is a precious heritage. The question then is, how then do you romanticize this? What are the costs of romanticizing this heritage, and so on and so forth? But it's not at all, they're acutely aware of their medieval heritage, not as a negative problem, but as a positive resource from which you can draw to build something better. That's really it, so thank you.
Thanks to both of you and to the audience, and I think we can continue next door with our usual reception. Thank you so much.
Thank you.